Hi everyone. In this tutorial, I will be covering radius and ulna. So they are bones of the forearm. They form the structural framework of our forearm. So radius and ulna, they are attached together by interosseous membrane. This is a flat sheet of ligament, and it holds radius and ulna together. So radius lies laterally, or it lies by the side of our thumb, and ulna lies medially, or it lies by the side of the fifth digit. And when we compare radius and ulna, radius is shorter than ulna. And as you see it here, it's thin proximally and thick distally. But ulna is longer than radius and thick proximally and thin distally. And the head of radius is found proximally, but the head of ulna is found distally. Now let's see the bones one by one. Let's start with ulna. So ulna is one example of long bone. So it has proximal end, shaft, and distal end. So when we see the proximal end has many bony features. So it has trochlear notch. So the proximal end contains a depression or a notch, which is known as trochlear notch. So this notch articulates with the medial condyle of humerus. So in the distal end of humerus has two condyles, medial and lateral condyle. And the medial condyle is known as trochlea. It looks like a pulley and it's named as trochlea. So this trochlea articulates with trochlear notch and it forms the major part of the elbow joint. And forming the posterior boundary of the trochlear notch, we have olecranon process. So this is olecranon process. And on the distal end of humerus, posteriorly, there is a fossa or a depression, which is known as olecranon fossa. So this olecranon process, it fits into that fossa. So especially during full extension, the olecranon process, it fits into the olecranon fossa. Forming the anterior boundary of the trochlear notch, there is coronoid process. So this coronoid process, it fits into the coronoid fossa of humerus. So on the anterior surface of humerus, above the trochlea, this is coronoid fossa. So during full flexion, the coronoid process fits into coronoid fossa. And just below the trochlear notch, laterally, ulna contains radial notch. So as the name indicates radial, this notch articulates with the head of radius, and it forms the proximal radio-ulnar joint. And this proximal radio-ulnar joint allows supination and pronation. It's a pivot joint, and it's where supination and pronation happens. And below the coronoid process, ulna contains a rough bony projection, which is known as ulnar tuberosity. And this ulnar tuberosity is insertion site for brachialis muscle. So brachialis muscle, one of the muscles in the arm, is inserted into ulnar tuberosity. In addition, as you see here, there is a crest. And this crest is known as spinator crest. And it's origin site for spinator muscle. So these are the features in the proximal end of ulna. And when we see the shaft, when we see a transverse section of the shaft is roughly triangular. It's more or less triangular. So it has three boundaries. It has anterior, posterior, and interosseous boundary, or border, I mean. So interosseous border, as the name indicates, it's attachment site for the interosseous membrane. And when you see the distal end of ulna, the distal end contains head. So the head of ulna is found distally. So the distal end contains head. And as you see it here, the head is covered with articular cartilage, and it forms articular circumference. So this articular circumference, or the head, articulates with radius, and it forms distal radio-ulnar joint. So we have proximal radio-ulnar joint and we have distal radio-ulnar joint. And in addition, the distal end contains styloid process. So it has a small projection, which is known as styloid process. So this styloid process is attachment site for the medial collateral ligament of the wrist joint. Now let's see radius. So radius lies laterally and it's relatively shorter. And like ulna, it's a long bone, so it has features in its proximal end, in its shaft, and in its distal end. So first, let's see the proximal end. So the proximal end of radius, it contains head. So this is the head of radius. And the head, as you see it here, it's covered with articular cartilage, and it forms articular circumference. So the head superiorly, it articulates with the capitulum of humerus, and it forms part of the elbow joint. But the head medially, it articulates with ulna, and it forms the proximal radio-ulnar joint. So the head superiorly, it articulates with humerus, and medially, it articulates with ulna. So superiorly, it will form part of the elbow joint, and medially, it forms the proximal radio-ulnar joint. So below the head, this constriction is the neck. And below the neck, it has a rough projection, a bony bump, which is known as radial tuberosity. And radial tuberosity is insertion site for the biceps brachii muscle. So ulna similarly has ulnar tuberosity for the insertion of brachialis muscle, and radial tuberosity is insertion for biceps brachii muscle. And when we see the shaft of radius, like ulna, when we see the transverse section, radius is also triangular. So it has three borders: anterior, posterior, and interosseous border. So interosseous border is for the attachment of interosseous membrane. And when you see the distal end of radius, distally, radius contains ulnar notch. So as the name indicates, ulnar notch, this depression or notch articulates with the head of ulna, and it forms the distal radio-ulnar joint. So like the proximal, the distal radio-ulnar is also a pivot joint. So there is a joint between radius and ulna proximally, distally, and there is also a joint in the middle. So the joint in the middle is a syndesmosis joint, but the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints are synovial joints. They are specifically pivot joints. And distally, radius also contains styloid process. So it contains a relatively bigger styloid process. And similarly, this styloid process is also attachment site for lateral collateral ligament of the wrist. In addition, distally, radius has carpal surface. So as the name indicates, carpal, this surface articulates with the proximal row of carpals, specifically with scaphoid and lunate, and it forms the wrist joint. So ulna doesn't have a carpal surface, so it doesn't participate in the formation of wrist joint. But radius has a carpal surface. As you see, this surface is lined with articular cartilage, and it articulates with the proximal row of carpals, and it forms the wrist joint. So radius and ulna, they are bones of the forearm, and both of them are long bones, so they have features proximally, in their shaft, and distally. So that's all about radius and ulna.